today, would you credit it? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, where I've noticed posts covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, it's the last day of September today, and so the RBA and APRA have been releasing their credit aggregate data. And also we got the building approvals data today, so I just want to walk through those numbers and highlight some of the key points. And it is quite interesting insofar that momentum with regard to credit is increasing, but building approvals are a bit all over the place, to be honest, so it'll be interesting to see where they head over the next few weeks. So let's start with the financial aggregates from the RBA. And they made the point that total credit for the year is up 4.7% compared with 2.1% a year ago. Within that, housing is up 6.2% annualised, compared with 3.2% a year ago. Personal credit is still down 5.6%, but it was 12.6% lower a year ago. And business credit is at 3.4% higher than a year ago, compared with 2.7%. And broad money is lower at 7.2% relative to 11.5%. And over the last month, total credit was up 0.6%, driven by housing up 0.6%. Personal was down 0.6%, business was up 0.6%, and broad money was up 0.2%. And compared with the trajectory a year earlier, total credit is slightly slower in the month, housing credit is pretty much the same, personal credit eased a little more positively, business credit was lower, and broad money was also lower this time than a year ago. So make that what you will. So let's look in more detail at the credit aggregate movements. This is the monthly movements. Housing was up 0.62% over the month overall. Within that, owner occupation was up 0.81% and investment was up 0.23%. So you can see that it's still all about owner occupation. Personal credit was 0.58% lower than last month. In other words, it's still reducing, but not as fast as the previous month, whereas business credit was up 0.57%, and that's explained very much by businesses in difficulty borrowing to get them out of trouble. It doesn't necessarily signify significant investment, according to my surveys at least. If I then look at the credit aggregate growth overall, all credit was up 0.59%, and broad money was up 0.15%. So you can see that that massive liquidity injection that we had a couple of months ago, and the even bigger one we had last year, is dissipating quite fast. Now, to be honest, those monthly numbers are very, very volatile. So if we then look at the annual aggregate, which irons out some of the bumps, you can see there that housing credit rose by 6.19% over the last 12 months. Owner occupation was up at 8.41%, and investment lending was up at 2.16%. Personal credit was still down just over 5.6%, and business credit was up 3.44% over the last year, with a considerable acceleration in recent times. But again, that relates more to people having to borrow to keep their businesses afloat rather than necessarily borrowing for investment purposes. And we can also then see that total credit was up 4.7%, which is pretty high now, and you have to go back to 2016-17 to see a similar rate of growth. Broad money is 7.23% annualised. It dropped significantly from that cash injection last year, but is still elevated. Then if we switch across to the APRA data, the monthly authorised deposit taking institution statistics, those statistics are actually based on the proportion of loans held at the ADIs. So that is a combination of new loans on, loans repaid, and loans refinanced. And they showed that owner-occupied loans for the ADIs or banks were up 1.46% over the last month. For investment lending, they were up 0.2%, having been somewhat lower last month. And that shows a total portfolio growth of just 1.02% over the last month. Another way of looking at is loan stock. So we can see that owner-occupation loans are growing faster than investment loans. The proportion of investment loans is now at 34.53% and is continuing to slide. And the total portfolio balance outstanding across the banks is $1.87 trillion, which is another record. Finally, we can also look at the portfolio movements across the various organisations. And you'll see there that Westpac and CBA are the most active lenders between July and August, followed by National Australia Bank and Macquarie Bank, and then Bendigo and HSBC. It's interesting that Westpac has grown its own occupier book, but not its investment book, whereas CBA and Macquarie are very much focusing also on investment loans, along, by the way, with AMP Bank. At the other end of the spectrum, ANZ dropped its owner-occupied and investment portfolios, which is continuing a trend we've seen for the last few months. And it highlights to me that there are some interesting changes of perspective between different lenders and different strategies in terms of their risk appetite and their wish to grow their loan portfolios. And in fact, Shane Elliott at ANZ did say that he was comfortable with much slower loan growth because he was concerned about the risks in the system. So you can see overall that we are continuing to notice considerable momentum in the lending sector, which is one reason why perhaps APRA should be thinking about macroprudential, except of course that a lot of loans have already been made, so in a way it's water under the bridge, and even if they were to bring controls in now, it wouldn't help those who have large loans even at this stage. And there are a number of households in our modelling that would actually register as extremely stressed. And in fact, we report that on a regular basis and we'll be updating it in a few days. Now, the other thing that came out today were the dwelling approvals figures. And those dwelling approvals were from the ABS. And it showed a slight recovery relative to last month. So this is what they said. The number of dwellings approved rose 6.8% in August, seasonally adjusted, ending a run of 4 consecutive monthly declines, according to data from the ABS. The increase in the total number of dwellings approved in August was driven by approvals for private sector dwellings, excluding houses, which rose 13.7%. Private sector houses also rose by 3.5%. The August results indicate that approvals for detached housing remain strong despite the unwinding of stimulus measures in April and the ongoing lockdowns in New South Wales and Victoria. Driven by record low interest rates, increased household savings and confidence in the housing market, private house approvals are 23.8% higher year on year and 42% higher than August 2019. Across Australia, the number of dwellings approvals rose in Western Australia, up 21%, South Australia up 11.8%, Victoria up 10.5%, and Queensland up 4% in seasonally adjusted terms. But there were falls recorded in Tasmania, down 18.9%, and in New South Wales, down 2.3%. Approvals for private sector houses rose in South Australia, up 16.6%, Victoria up 6.1%, and New South Wales up 7%, but it fell in Western Australia, down 7.3%, and in Queensland, down 5.2%. The value of total building rose 20.3% in season-adjusted terms, and the value of non-residential buildings rose 43.8%, having fallen 30.6% in July. And the rise in August was driven by a strong increase in private sector approvals. And the value of total residential buildings rose 9.2%, comprising a 9% increase in new residential building and a 10% rise in alterations and additions. And the value of approvals for alterations and additions rose for the second highest level recorded, behind April 2021. So a couple of interesting observations there. The first, there is no doubt still an overhang from those earlier government stimulus measures, both at a state and federal level. Of course, many of those approvals will lead to constructing activity down the track, but their delivery will be slow because they can't get the labour and they can't get the materials. And we're still seeing a number of cases where the approved price and the final price is different. In other words, people are contracted for more than they thought they were simply because the materials are effectively lifting the price in the contract. The other point to make is this idea that there are more people spending money on approvals and additions and alterations. We're seeing that in our surveys because some people have decided that it's too expensive to try and shift to somewhere else, so they are making improvements locally. And of course, if you're locked down and can't go out much, then making improvements around the house is quite a good way to spend some time. And we're seeing that also happening considerably. So it'll be interesting to see what happens ahead. But I still think there's a contention between standalone houses and units, and particularly high-rise units. And the approval rate amongst units is hugely volatile because if you think about it, when an approval is made for a significant development, then the number of dwelling units is significant, and that means that they move all over the place. So don't take too much notice of 1 month's information. But the standalone houses is a more robust series, and clearly there is considerable demand still. And we'll see that ahead, I think. So, again, standing back, you can see that credit is still very much on the cards, and building approvals are still following. So, property and home prices and mortgages in Australia are all still heading up. The question, of course, is for how much longer will this be true? And what happens if the indicators start turning down, or if indeed macro-prudential intervention tightens mortgage lending? That, of course, now becomes a very relevant question. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.